Hi, Jerry.
Hi, Ellen. Hey, Mark.
There.
Doesn't really start.
Richard, hi.
Hi, Charlie.
Really putting your picture in?
Well, if he hasn't.
Hi, Richard.
Hi. Well, suddenly we have pictures, huh?
Well, until they decide, I think it has to do with bandwidth. Sometimes they run it for personal things. They said they would sometimes not let you do pictures if they were running out of space. They Zoom for the free account.
Not with my picture.
I can shut off the video.
You
Okay.
don't have to. I mean, if Zoom wants to shut off the video, they'll shut off the damn video.
I think I'm going to shut it off. Yeah. Okay. No?
Yes, then I'll just come.
Did I hear Naomi?
Yes, she's coming.
Hi, Naomi.
Hi.
Wow, see. Hi, Naomi.
Hi. Are you sure they can't see us?
I can see you.
What?
I can see you, Naomi. I'm kidding. I can't see you.
That would be difficult, I think. You have a good imagination, maybe.
Oh, yes.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Put my earphones on. I'll start my video and make sure that my face is somewhere in the picture. Thank you, Jerry. And we'll start. Okay. So this is a share that's a little different than I usually give, and you'll see that I'll cheat a little bit because of it. Normally, I only give shiurim on topics that I've had a long time to study, and I try and absorb everything, and I get hopefully more time to think about how to teach than to prepare. This is, I think, a very timely topic, but not one that I've had anywhere near enough time to really absorb all the materials. I'm sorry, I'm a little out of breath. There we go. So I want to talk a little bit about how halakhah works in Dinei Mamonot, and then I'm going to do probably in large measure an introduction to really how we should handle this topic, and then we'll see how far we get in this year, and then we'll decide exactly what we want to do tomorrow. So the introduction is that Dinei Mamonot and halakhah. Let's talk about justice first. So justice is a complicated term, right? Many of you have studied Plato, and you know that justice is a complicated term. But more than that, there are, at least in Dinei Mamonot, there are at least two fundamental notions, which often square with each other. One is a notion that you should get what the law says you should get, and the idea is that the law should also square with some independent notion of ethics. But for now, let's assume that you should get what the law says you should get, and right, that's one kind of thing. And a second is that that what's fair or not is determined by two different factors. One is the relative power of the parties involved, and the more Marxist you are, the more likely that is going to affect your consideration. But assuming that there's nothing fundamentally unjust about the relationship between the parties, then justice is often a measure of getting what you getting out of a relationship what you expected. There isn't really an objectively or necessarily an objectively right or wrong notion of what of how a dini mamonos issue should be resolved. Fundamentally, it should be resolved in terms of the expectations of the parties, especially if they entered into a formal contract. So one of the basic challenges for halakhah, living as it does in a world where many, if not most, of our contractual relationships are outside the Jewish community, or outside at least certainly the presumed jurisdiction of halakhah, so our expectations in many ways are governed by by factors other than halakhah. That's A. And B, one of the reasons that going according to the law yields justice is that the law is predictable. Right? People know what expectations are shaped by the law, and then following the law meets both assumptions of justice. But since halakhah has very few cases, or a very narrow band of cases, it's very difficult to have any expectations at all about halakhah. And that raises deep challenges about how to deal with cases that have real, cases where the purpose is not just to resolve it in some way or other, but the purpose is to reach a substantively just result. It's very hard to do that by following halakhah per se. Okay, so we ask, what does Judaism say about this? So there's often not a real answer, because what Judaism says about this is you should do what the parties expect, assuming that their relationships are, the initial starting points are not things that we find inherently ethically objectionable. And so figuring out what you should do is really a matter of figuring out whether you think the initial relationships were just and what the expectations of the parties are. And the problem is the expectations of the party may be very different than the expectations of the party that halachic precedents assume. Okay, so we have a number of reasons that halakhah is problematic. One is that it doesn't, in practice, govern the expectations of its constituents. Their expectations are often governed by their experiences in a non-halachic realm. Secondly, there often simply are not enough precedents to create expectation within halakhah, so that even if we say, okay, people are bound, right, they're religiously supposed to have the expectations of halakhah, and that we have to do this, because if we don't allow that, then eventually halakhah is completely useless, because if we allow people to legitimately have expectations other than halakhah, so then who needs halakhah? But we simply, there is no way to have expectations based on halakhah, because there simply isn't enough of a body of precedent. So those are the two things that I want to set out. And if you look at the treatments of the issue of whether employers are bound to pay the wages of their employees during the current crisis, you'll see that they tend to be very qualified, and not, and say basically would have to hear the cases before we say anything much at all. So what I want to do today, and on this mere 7-page source sheet, is I want to first teach several tshuvot that set the precedent for thinking, perhaps non-halachically, about what halakha, or what a beit din should say about cases like this. And then I'm going to take just like the first line and a half of one of the several excellent presentations of the academic halachic academic presentations, in the sense that they were presented as, here's what halakha has to say, as opposed to here's what halakha says you should do. So we'll just take the first paragraph of one and look up one footnote, so you can see what it would really take for me to begin to command this material. And then if we have time, I also prepared an outline of what I see as the fundamental issues that are addressed in the technical halachic literature. And that, I think, is probably more than we can get through today. We'll see if we do. And then depending where we get today, tomorrow we'll do some samples of footnotes deeper into the literature. Okay. I guess even right now, if people have questions, this would be a good time to stop and ask them if anyone has a question already. Okay, I'm guessing not then. Okay, just gonna make sure that I can see the chat. Okay, so we're gonna start with a tshuva of the Trumas Hadeshin. So we're in, I think it's 13th century. I never remember, 13th or 14th century Ashkenaz. And the thing about the Trumas Hadeshin is that at least some of his questions are presumed to be self-written, or that he writes the questions and he answers. So you don't know whether this is actually something that it was intended or was actually applied in practice, or whether it's just his theoretical position of what should be. Okay, so here's what the Trumas Hadeshin says. Sheila, Tzibur hutal alehem mas, right? So you have some kind of community that has had the government impose some kind of tax on it. V'hiskimu sheyichtavu kol echad echad kol asher yesh lo mechuyev b'mas. So they agree that everybody everybody should write down whatever possessions they have that are obligated in tax, right? So the tax is a wealth tax, right? It's an asset-based tax, not an income-based tax. Income-based taxes were notoriously much harder to evaluate. So and maybe they're less fair than asset-based taxes. So classical misim were always asset-based. V'yishaval kacha shelo hivriach me'uma, right? The editor says hivriach. I don't know if the Trumas Hadeshin was bound by his grammar. Right? So everyone will swear that they have not hidden any of their assets. There's nothing in the Cayman Islands or anything like that. When vakesh l'dayan, shivarer lehem al pi hadin hachiyuv haptur, right? And they want some impartial judge based on this ledger of everybody's assets to decide what the obligations are and what the obligations are not. Right? Whether it's on behalf of those who directly pay the tax, right? And those for whom I think I'm not sure what nitanim mehen means here. I had thought it meant those who have it paid for them, but I'm not entirely sure that's right. And how you evaluate all this in terms of din Torah, right? So they ask for two questions. One is they ask for Torah, and the other is they ask for popular precedent. Maybe those two go along, and maybe they don't. Maybe they're intention. So here's his answer. He thinks that this depends much more on what past practice is, and what I'm saying is that past practice is really a proxy for current expectations. Then it depends on actual Torah principles. Right? He said explicitly that most of the matter of distribution of the communal tax liability depends on past custom rather than on any kind of Torah principles. And he quotes the famous line the Mordechai writes in front of Rebbe Katz, Al Yana Mas, the minhag mevatel halakhah. Right, that even if there were Torah principles, not just that the minhag overrides a vacuum, but the minhag even overrides places where, if you asked for what do the precedential formal texts of halakhah say, they would say X, but you follow what the prior custom in that community is. How that prior custom developed is not currently an issue yet. Right, it says Vatel halakhah v'din chachmei haTalmud, afal pi shematzu lo smach min hamikra. Even if the chachmei haTalmud, right, put their principles onto a biblical context, right? Matzu lo smach is an ambiguous term. Does it mean things they really said are deoraisa, or does it mean things that they found in asmachta for it? I don't know how precise his language is. V'chasav nami the lav dafk minhag chachamim, and he said that this custom doesn't have to be one that's instituted by the elite scholarly class. Ela afilu minhag chamarim v'safanim. But even if it's a minhag that's just instituted among donkey haulers or ship sailors, right? Whatever the custom of the trade is, yesh lismach aleihem. You can, right? If you, the judge, are supposed to rely on the custom of the trade as opposed to your halachic precedents. And he quotes a case where we treat such customs not in terms of taxes, but he quotes a case where we treat such such customs as binding halakhically. Okay, so now he says, Do we really want to go that far and claim that whatever popular custom is goes, and in my formulation, there's no principle of justice other than expectations? So first, Venira, Afalgav the Katav Rabbeinu Tam Velchiach Mamish Merasnisin Baba Basra Meresh Perakapolim. The Yesh bin Hagim Shel Shtus, right? Even though Rabbeinu Tam establishes from other Mishnayos, right, that there are customs which we treat our customs as shtus, right? So they're wrong. Right? On any objective basis, these customs should have no halachic weight at all. Right? Rabbeinu Tam proves there are some customs that even where the official halakhah stated is everything follows the custom of the land. I'd say, for example, in terms of what the expectations of hours and working conditions are. Nonetheless, some customs are absurd, right? Or perhaps, in my formulation, some customs reflect an inappropriate initial power relationship, and so they're not actually just, right? That could be one of those reactions, or they could just be ridiculous. And the Rosary said, no, this notion of minhag v'atel halacha only applies if the custom is established by scholars. Okay, and the Mordechai quotes the Rosary. It means dafka minhag vatikin, not just ordinary scholars, but high class scholars. Aval minhag, right? Aval minhag she'ein lo raya min Torah, and he seems to argue the verse that if you have a minhag that has no Torah basis, and no ela toeh b'shikol hadas, anybody who rules on the basis of custom, if that custom is unrooted in halakhah, he seems to think that if a judge rules that way, so they have made an error in judgment. It's not reversible, but they have made an error. So toeh b'shikol hadas means a judgment error, as opposed to a formal error of law, and therefore it's a mistake, but it's not reversible. So even though we have all these sources saying that even where it says explicitly in the Mishnah or in other halachic sources, hakol minhag hamedina, that everything follows the standard custom. Nonetheless, right, that doesn't mean that we follow customs that are not Torah rooted. The Trumas Hadeshin says mikol makom nireh lamar d'minyanei misim v'chi haygavna kulhu modu dazlinan basar min hagam d'vnei ha'ir uvnei hamedina shenahagu b'mikedem. He thinks that all those positions are dealing with something other than questions of taxes and things like them. In question of taxes and things like them, everyone agrees that we follow the custom of the relevant jurisdictional community, whether it's the city or the state. Even if it was not established by scholars, right? As again, he thinks Rabbi Katz demonstrated this in the matter of right, where the Talmud upholds the customs of donkey drivers and sailors. Okay, but now we have to ask the question, right? Fundamentally, the issue is going to be, what is the criterion that distinguishes inyanei misim v'chi haygavna from other types of areas, such that inyanei misim expectations govern completely, whereas in other areas the expectations have to have been generated by something that has a basis in Torah. So it seems you can distinguish between taxes and even matters within the trades of donkey drivers and sailors. The other example the Gemara talks about there is just people in I think I might have skipped a line here. Yeah, I might have skipped a line here. This is, pardon me 1 second, if I want to check if I somehow elided a line, because that doesn't seem to follow. That would be very bad. Pardon me 1 second. We're in Trumas Hadeshin Shin Mem Beis. Okay, let's just call it up quickly to make sure I didn't skip a line. I apologize. Those of you who haven't seen the Bar Ilan software now, they get to see it in action. It's the most amazing thing. Hadeshin, Trumas Hadeshin. I think we said Reish Mem Beis, right? Let's see which section of the Trumas Hadeshin it's in.
Shin Membet.
Shin Mem Beis. Sorry, my fault. Thank you. I don't remember things well under pressure. Shin Mem Bet. And there's two sections of Trumas Hadeshin. Also, I don't remember which section. It's not this one. Oh, it is. It is this section. Okay. So here we go. Yeah. Okay. So I think I just didn't parse it right, and I put the line wrong. Okay. So we'll say you can distinguish between matters within matters of the city and the donkey drivers, to people who are simply trying to govern the workings of a caravan. Anything which involves a collective, right? This is his key phrase, whether we have the parsing of the previous cases right or not. Everything that involves a group combined, right? So if you're dealing, anytime you're dealing with a collective has to be governed by its own customs. According to the system they set up for governing their own matters. Why? Because if we required them to follow the laws of the Torah and everything, and not their own internal customs that have built up, let's assume those internal customs now we're talking about customs that are built up naturally. We're not talking about a positive structure that they set up for themselves, but a system that can now go of itself. The Olam Teir Meriva Benehem. So he claims it's socially bad policy to have people try and follow an abstract legal system rather than to govern them in accordance with their own expectations. Okay, Mishum Hachi, for this purpose, Meikara Mochalu Ahadadi Levater al Din Torah, right? So because everyone in the group understands this, it's a kind of social contract notion. They each in advance forgive each other whatever rights they would have under Din Torah that are not carried out and embodied in their body of custom. The Gamri Umakne, right, and they make halakhically committed, halakhically binding commitments to Lemezel Basar Seder Minag Ditu to follow their own customs. Okay, and now he says in addition, another way of framing this is in addition to taxes and internal trades. Okay, right? So the Maram says that partners can transfer assets among themselves or make commitments among themselves simply by speaking without engaging in a formal halachic act of commitment. Because right, they do this because the benefit they have of having confidence in each other's in the other to act on each other's words, that's a sufficient basis for them to surrender their formal legal rights and be bound by verbal commitments. Right, the bechol midi de isle revacha lahai kimo lahai b'mir b'alma val yedei doy. I'm not sure what that word means. Makni hadadi. Right, so whenever it's mutual benefit to waive the halachic rules of formal acts of commitment, that's sufficient. Okay. So what circumstances don't we say this? Right, everything in society should be governed purely by expectations. Why do we ever have a notion of law? So Rabbeinu Tam the Orzaruah, who distinguished between customs that have either a basis in human authority or a basis in Torah, and customs that have no such basis. They're talking about chiluk chatzeros ubatim uvinyan shalahem, v'aschiras poalim, v'chein schiras batim v'chatzeros, v'chol ki hagavna de'ein rabba mitzdarfim, v'lo itzarech mitzdarfu l'mehavet saisi hadadi. They're talking about situations which they claim include employer-employee relationships or neighborly relationships. Those are all things which he argues do not require the same kind of collective expectation that are required by taxes and the other examples he gave. Right? That's why in those cases you need a minhag that has a basis in al pi chachamim v'rayim in a Torah or one or the other. The minhag be'alma, that any kind of custom, right, a mere minhag mivatel behen din Torah. Okay, then he says you have to have standards, right, for the expectations. Amnam nira. The tzrichim le'da the minhag kavua pashutu shenatnu kach b'nei ha'ir l'chol ha'pachos tlosa zimnin. Right, so you have to find at least 3 cases of precedent. You can't just say this happened once, and when it happened once, we did it, because that isn't enough to establish a rule or expectations, he thinks. Because he says in emergencies, right, what the community does is often make ad hoc decisions with no notion that they're actually creating expectations for the future. So the fact that it happened once is not sufficient precedent to establish a custom that overrides the law. So if it happened once before, you might have to go back and default to Torah. Okay, Mikol Makom, he says, however, even though you do have to demonstrate the existence of the custom, we don't require very formal rules of evidence in order to establish it. But we accept testimony from, you accept hearsay testimony, you accept testimony from people or invalid witnesses. And the Maram wrote that the same thing is true about cheskat yishuv, which was the question of whether you had a right to prevent immigrants from coming in if you thought that would challenge you economically, which is a whole separate share. Because it says, in a case which involves the entire community, so then every person in the community is monetarily affected, and therefore everybody is invalid for witnesses. Right? Because everybody has a stake in the matter. So therefore, when it comes to establishing the custom, you can't be a stickler for formal rules of evidence. Okay, but now he says, Achein nira. But it seems to me, even though I showed above that when it comes to taxes, by which I mean the distribution of a communal tax liability amongst the individuals of the community, we say that past custom overrides the halakhah. Mikol makom, nonetheless, but the job of the judge is to try, right, if possible, is to reconcile the custom with Torah law. So Torah law plays a role in the sense that when the custom is ambiguous, or the custom can lead to multiple legal outcomes, this is sort of like the Israeli legal system in a sense that which allows you to bring in halakhah when there isn't a precedent in the various other legal systems that Israel treats as precedent. So here too, he says that your primary basis is custom, but there will always be cases that are not resolvable by custom, or there are multiple ways of understanding the custom, and you should always try and reconcile the custom to halachic precedent to the extent that you can. Afim lo legamre, right? Even if you can't do it entirely, mikol makam adif tvei shenimtzu sad v'smach medivrei chachamim u'lo k'minu b'tam v'svara. But even though you can't always reconcile it completely, some things you have to abandon. But it's better to find some kind of connection than to find none at all. Okay, so the questions for us now are, first of all, is the current situation in the current situation? So A is what is the basis of our expectations, and what's the boundary of the community that frames our expectations, and that will govern the extent to which halakhah is relevant to the situation. Do we, right? So that is, I should point a key distinction, right? That there's an intermediate issue which halakhah tends to resist very strongly, which is to say, people's expectations are that this will be settled in the secular courts. So that halakhah has a strong objection to. We could claim it's a biblical violation of lifnehem, right? Means you have an obligation to bring your legal cases to the halachic courts and not to the secular courts. So if you simply prefer the secular courts over the halachic system, not because they frame your expectations, because they frame your expectations, then a halachic court could make the same decisions based on the same expectations, but because you prefer their judgment or their rules intrinsically. So that is in itself a halachic problem, and that gets into the general question of, but what about in the United States? Obviously, that it doesn't help. It's not relevant in any case between Jews and non-Jews, and it's not relevant in any case between Jews and other Jews who have no interest in the ruling of the court. And probably I think it has no relevance in any case where both parties are not in advance willing to accept the ruling of a halachic court. But for now, right? But I think we at least have to ask the question among people, right? If you're dealing with cases among people, all of whom are willing to accept the jurisdiction of a Beit Din, and that, for example, is what there are cases in Lakewood where you're dealing with entirely from communities, and there's enough social pressure on the part of the Beit Din that if somebody went to secular court without going to Beit Din, they would oppose it. So then you're dealing with with a pure halachic question, but still within that community, what are the expectations? And a really challenging thing, obviously, is what if the multiple people in the community have very different expectations, right? What if your community includes, right? What if your employer, for example, expects has its expectations framed by halakhah, but your employees include people who, even if they're Jewish, never considered the possibility of going to Beit Din, and certainly never considered being bound by halakhah as opposed to whatever they see or hear on on the local talk radio show about employer rights and things like that, right? So those are really big issues. Okay, so this is one source, and another question. So the question is, do we have any expectations currently in the United States for how to deal with this? Are there precedents? And do we have any framework within halakhah for dealing with cases like this? So the answer, to some extent, is going to be that in Israel, there are, unfortunately, there are cases that might be thought similar, which is what happens if contracts are broken when a war breaks out, or if there are specific security alerts that cancel specific contracts. So there are precedents in Israeli Batei Din. There is very little in America. Okay, so let's now go to a second tshuva, right? So the first tshuva, the Trumas Hadeshin, basically says that expectations govern abstract notions of halakhah, and where there are no expectations, then you go back to halakhah. So now let's take a look at a later development in the Chatam Sofer. This is the Chatam Sofer dealing with, as he'll tell you, in the aftermath of a fire, right? Po Kala Kodesh, Matistorf, right? So something happened on the 18th of Adar Sheni, right? Past Adar Sheni, there was a fire, and the fire started in the house of a non-Jew, but it kept eating and burned down most of the Jewish quarter. And there was an international fundraising drive, and funds were sent from communities all around the world to help the Jews. And now the question is, how do we divide the relief fund that was sent to our community? So they turn to Chassam Sofer and they say, can you please decide how to distribute the relief fund? Now, how did they ask you to do it? Al pi din Torah, via Torah, o karov lezeh, or in some way close to Torah, right? And we want, right? So they have three different goals. We want it to be din Torah, or we want it to be something like din Torah, and we want it to lead to communal peace. So here is the Chassam Sofer's line. V'nei yadua, it is well known. Shadvarim ka'elu, efshar b'shum ofen ladunam b'din Torah mamash. It's impossible to judge these matters on the basis of actual Torah law. Right? His line, efshar b'shum ofen ladunam b'din Torah mamash. Right? And this is Yodua advar. Everybody, right? Yodua. Everybody knows that you can't do this. And he quotes the Trumas Hadeshin on the basis of this. Ach binyan hakar l'din Torah. Rather, you have to judge it on the basis of something which is close to din Torah, the curve l'seichel enoshi, and also something that makes common sense. L'damos milsa l'milsa, to draw analogies. B'dimyon karov ksas, with some kind of reasonable analogy. Okay, so now the Chassam Sofer claims that he is acting on the basis of the Trumas Hadeshin, but I think you can look at it and see that there is a large difference in that he mentions absolutely nothing about custom, because there is no custom here, right? It seems that this is an unprecedented matter, and he's immediately going to tell you that he has a previous. The only case which looks previous is not in fact parallel. Okay, Kfar Kasafti Tshuva Aruka Binyan Kiyotze Behezeg Mayim Sheba Lehem Siyom Me'esar HaMedina. He said, I gave a different thing in terms a long tshuva about how to distribute government relief works in the aftermath of a flood. And there I said, the right halachic analogy is partnership profits. But here we're not talking about profits earned by partners. Here we're talking about distribution to the poor, and that has a very different basis in halacha. V'achonein ladam das yireinu niflaot miturato, lo nikashel chas v'shalom, v'hu yasher hidrim l'fnei. Right. So the Sam Sofer says, right, the key line here is Yadua. Everybody knows shedvarim ka'elu efshar b'shum ofan ladunam adin Torah mamish. Everybody knows you can't judge this kind of thing on the basis of pure Torah law. The question is, why not? So, right, he quoted the Trumas Hadeshin. The Trumas Hadeshin had a very simple reason. The Trumas Hadeshin said that justice is a matter of expectations, and so if people have contrary expectations, you can't use din Torah. But here the Sam Sofer says nothing about contrary expectations, nothing about communal custom. In fact, this is exactly the case where the Trumas Hadeshin said that you have to be very careful to establish that there was a custom, and here there was no custom. So if you read the Trumas Hadeshin, right, he seems to think that in cases like that, what you have to go back to is you have to go, at the very least, you can only use customs that are established by Chachamim, and in the absence of that, right, the Torah, you go back to halakhah. So I don't think the Chassam Sofer is really based on the Trumas Hadeshin in that sense. He has a totally different notion. His notion is that there's a class of cases which simply cannot be judged by Torah. So the question is, what's the basis of that class of cases? Okay. So here I want to give you a citation from Usher Weiss, contemporary of Usher Weiss, who has many books, all entitled Minchad Asher. Minchad Asher on Torah is a collection largely of his halachic writings, but with biblical interpretation and twists, and his halachic writings are often grounded in broad ethical principles. It's one of the things that's very attractive about his scholarship. So here he is talking about the concept of pshara. So pshara halachically is the notion that sometimes the outcome of a case is a compromise, literally, right? A pshara is a mid ground, right? What Rabbi Sender and Sharon used to call lukewarm water, right? Waters that are neither hot or cool, and it's a compromise between the parties. There is a tension starting, at least in the Talmud, halachic tension as to whether this is an ideal outcome or a post facto acceptable outcome. We distinguish sharply between cases where the judges already know what the outcome of the case is, in cases, or at least they know where the law is tending, and cases where they don't know where the law is tending, and whether the parties themselves are interested in compromise, or whether the judges are seeking to drive them to compromise, or there are all those factors. Just give it, a very shallow background. Let's read what Rav Asher Weiss says about pshara. He says, in addition to the categories he's listed previously, which don't matter to us, I found another category of pshara, shehismicho Chazal al papasuk tzedek tzedek tirdov, that Chazal attached, again, whatever you think the words to be somech something is, to the pasuk, justice, justice, thou shalt pursue. V'chein amru b'sanhedrin lamed bet amed bet, Kedetanya, tzedek tzedek tirdov. Why does it say tzedek twice? Echad ledin, because one form of tzedek is based on law, and another form of tzedek is based on pshara, right? And what is the example? So if you have two boats that are traversing a river, and they meet each other, and if they both try and pass through the neck of the waterway, then they'll crash into each other and drown. But if they take turns, then they both pass, and the question is who passes first. And the same with two camels, right, walking through a narrow mountain pass, right? What happens among them? So what should you do in those cases? So the one which is laden, takes precedence over the one which is not laden, and the one which is closer takes precedence over the one which is not closer, right? So we have some kind of rules of precedence in those kind of areas. You have other kinds of cases in the Gemara. What happens if a king and a bride meet at a crossroad, or all sorts of test cases like that way. Okay, or if there's no objective basis, then find a way to make a compromise among them. Right, that's Chosh Mishnah Paskins this way also. So he says. So here is actually it's the one which has further to go. I think I'm not really sure. Okay, so what the Minchad Asher says is this. Right, these grounds for judging amongst the two boats, or two camel drivers. That you give precedence to the one right, to the one which is laden or the one, I think, from further away. Or there's further to go again, I'm not sure which, I apologize. Ein ba min mishpat, there is nothing legal, right? There's no basis in Torah for this, all right, for this decision. Ela min musar v'hatzedek, it's just based on an abstract concept of justice. V'af ma she'amru b'shnehem tu'unim yasu pshara. And we say if they're both equally laden, then we should make a compromise between them. So he says, under most circumstances, the reason we make a compromise is that we don't know for sure which way the law should go. There is, we believe in principle, a legal decision, but because there are conflicting opinions or there are ambiguities about the case, we don't know which the proper legal decision is. We don't know who's right. So since we don't know who's right, we come to a compromise. But here he says, what it means is when there is no legal basis for making a decision, you can still make decisions, but the way you make decisions are not based on any kind of legal precedent. They're based on a concept of yosher, of ethics, and of pshara, which seems to be some notion of, I think, of the idea that everyone should feel that they won in some way, right? It's sort of about the feelings of the parties. Okay, Venira ikar b'yisod hadvarim, that seems to him fundamentally, the chol geder hapshara, ein no din v'gam lo tzedakah, ela mishpat musar yesh bo. He thinks the whole concept of pshara in Judaism is not a question of law, and neither is it a question. That is really interesting. What does he mean by tzedakah? Ela mishpat hamusar yesh bo, right? But rather, it is a fundamental notion of ethics, because the michad gisa ein kan hachraat mikivshan hagunashal Torah mishpat. You can't. There's no intellectual resolution to it. Ach yesh po midata yosher v'hamusar. But even though there's nothing intellectual that will get you the result, right? Nonetheless, there is the character of ethics. Right, and there is a space in halachic decisions about money for pure ethics. And so what drives the acceptability of reaching decisions based on compromise is not that we don't know what the outcome is, and it's not right. It's not that expectations necessarily are different than law. It's simply that there is a notion of abstract justice. Okay, so now we have a whole array of principles that enable us to deviate from pure Torah law. You have the Trumas Hadeshin, who says that that in matters where you have Rabim Mitzurafim Yachad, you have a lot of people who are acting, right, who are framed as a group, right? I would say they form a society. So any group that forms a society has to be governed by its, at least in matters of money, has to be governed by their own expectations rather than by any kind of law, and their own expectations are binding. But when they have no expectations, the Trumas Hadeshin seem to think, then you resort to formal law. The Chassam Sofer, who claims mysteriously that there are things which everyone knows cannot be judged by din Torah mamash. He does not explain what those things are, but he gives you examples of them. They're responses to overwhelming events that can't have happened before and that happen to groups, right? Those are all the criteria we can have. We have to decide which of them are essential. And so what you judge them on, right, is he has a whole new category, things that are close to Torah by analogy. Now, this is not quite the same thing. So the Trumas Hadeshin at the end of it said that we should try to reconcile custom with Torah to the extent possible. Chassam Sofer doesn't talk about reconciling. He says that whatever you're doing which is not din Torah mamash, it should still be close by analogy to din Torah, not at all the same intellectual process as the Trumas Hadeshin, although possibly there is an underlying relationship. And then you have the Minchad Asher, who says that there is a space for just just abstract justice in certain kinds of cases, and he derives this from Pshara. Okay, so now I'm trying to remember how I got to that Minchad Asher. This is my fault. There must be a space in the original Minchad Asher which I forgot to quote, in which he quotes the Chassam Sofer, I think, but I'm not sure. So that I apologize again for that. I didn't get to this magically. I didn't know it in advance. Okay, so now we have one more source we need to read. This is something that is not in the response of the Chassam Sofer, but it's in a book of memories of the Chassam Sofer that includes a letter that the Chassam Sofer himself wrote about a case very much like ours. Or I think it's in the aftermath of a battle in the Napoleonic Wars. So it's very poetic. It says, "Vayidal Yisrael." Okay, so Israel became poor. Ki kvar me'ezeh shavuot avru shavat over orach ve'ein koneh u'macher v'hotzaot ravu gam ravu. Okay, so there are no passers-by, so the economy is dead. There are no buyers and sellers, but expenses are just the same as they were. And because we're dealing with the aftermath of a battle, many people have to hire guards, right? And their expenses are huge, right? They're paying 50 gold pieces a day for these guards. And then aside from that, he says you have to rebuild. Rebuild the houses that were burned down, and that can be 23,000 gold pieces per house. And even if they weren't destroyed by the house, they've got lots of bullet holes in them, and that can be 2,000 or 3,000 gold pieces of repairs. And all the more so, right? You have to replace the goods that were inside the house. And so desperately poor people are coming to the house, and the burden on everybody is extraordinarily heavy. In addition to that, he says, Var min dain, there are many students who are scattered, and they're very pressed. Right, they're very pressed for just basic living expenses, let alone for housing and for bedding, let alone for food. Right, to find food to keep themselves alive, because beforehand, he says, there was a big yeshiva here, right? Sometimes it had 150 students, but now there are very few, and that'll be, that's going to happen until God has mercy and brings everyone back together. And furthermore, here you have the immediate precedent. There are lots of teachers and students who are trying to figure out, what do we do now that we can't learn? We can't teach, we can't learn. And particularly their question is, so do the teachers get paid? I'm not sure why he says talmidim. It might be that the talmidim were promised a stipend for learning, and and that they don't get their stipend at all. So the question is, do these teachers and students get their stipends even though they have not been able to be in yeshiva? Do they get paid, and do they get paid or not? So I, the Chassam Sofer, I say in my humility, Din Torah lo yodati. I just have no idea what the halakhah is in this case. Okay, what do we do? We have no idea what the halakhah is in this case. So he says, Va'ani mishalem li schirim sheli scharam mishulam b'li nikui klal. So what I'm doing is, I am paying all my employees their complete salaries without deducting anything at all. B'li nikui klal means with no deductions. V'atem, but you, whoever he's writing to, tivtzeu hadin al derech hapesher. Right, you serving as judges, you should rule in accordance with a compromise thing, which means what? The shalem chetzio v'yafsid hamalamed chetzio. You should make everyone pay half. Okay, what's the basis of this? He says, V'tam ovnimuko. The basis of this judgment is ki barurhu shu kedin makat medina. He says that this outcome is parallel to the law of what is called the makat medina. So here, for the first time, we have an actual halachic analogy. There's a category called makat medina, right, a blow to the state, and he hasn't defined this yet, but there is such a thing, and he claims that this case fits the category of makat medina, and secondly, that the outcome of a makat medina is that you pay half, is that the employer and the employee each get half as a pshara. Now he says, you know that the Sefer Mirat Inayim, the standard commentary on Choshen Mishpat, wrote a long piece about this. The Datosh Yosida Melamed Kula, and he thought that the employee loses everything. Right, and he thought that when the Marami Rottenberg's words, which seem to suggest that the employer loses everything, he thought, right, that at most that means that the employer loses half. So now you have two positions. One position says that you split, and one position says that the employee loses everything. You might end up with the employee only getting a quarter. But he thinks that the Shach disagrees with the Sma, and the Shach and the Maram Padua, who he thinks that the Sma was not aware of, are Nechonim Od, right? They're really true. But he says, okay, so he says that if I drew this analogy to Makat Medina, I think the outcome would be half-half. But what I did is I paid all my employees entirely, and now he says, Achadavar kashem me'od beinai, but I find it very difficult. My tama l'hotzi mamon mibali habayit, kevan shu Makat Medina l'mazal shnehem shevabo, ve'ein l'mar shemazalo shel zeh gorem tfei mimazal shel zeh. I find it very hard to make people pay because it's not there. Right? There's no way you can claim that the employer is more at fault than the employee. Right? So that's an interesting notion. Now you could understand this to mean I find it very hard to make him pay more than half, but that doesn't seem to me the simplest reading. The simplest reading means that I find it hard to make them pay at all. Right? So you have three different levels. He pays his employees completely. He thinks that what the other judges should do is impose a 50-50 split. But the truth is he finds it really difficult because he doesn't understand why employers should pay at all because they're not at fault in any way. Okay. But he found a text which seems to suggest he believes that the employer has to pay completely, but he says over there, but you got to look at another sugya, and that's hard, right? And he said, right, and he looks at the sugya there, right? That when he says you have to look in Perek Mekabel, he's talking about a case of people who rent agricultural land in exchange for a rent which is supposed to be paid. It's a fixed rent, but it's supposed to be paid out of the produce of the field, and then the field does not produce, right? So the Gemara seems to think that the language there is mazal shel migaram, right? Whose fate was it, right? Who was intended to suffer? So that's a challenging notion to figure out what exactly that means. But he says, "Ba'od hasam hachocher hu amuchzak." Another category over there, since the payment is supposed to come in kind out of the produce, so obviously the renter is currently in possession of whatever he would have to pay, and possession is a high percentage of the law. That's what we call in halakhah, right? The muchzak is the person who is currently in legal possession, not necessarily rightful possession, but is recognized by the law as being in possession. And we say, if you want to remove something by law from the legal possession of another, the burden of proof is on you, even if they can't prove legal possession, but if they can't prove rightful possession, if they can prove legal possession, which in the case of movable goods just means that it's currently in their hands and nobody can demonstrate that it got into their hands illegally, so then the burden of proof is on you. Okay, so there, Shapir Inake L'Balabayas Gabi Makas Medina, Dematzi Amar Mazal Didach L'Chud Garam, because he can say in that case, how can you prove that it wasn't your mazal as opposed to my mazal? So since he's in possession, the burden of proof is the other way. Basha Ein came Malamed, but here, where the teachers were not paid in advance, obviously raises the question: what if they were? So the burden of proof is the other way around. So how can you make the balabayit pay? So it seems to me that the simplest way of reading this is that he thinks the right thing to do is to pay your employees completely. The just thing to do is to split it, and the legal thing to do is to, if it actually went to law, then you would have to let the money stay where it is, which means that in his circumstances, the vast majority of employees would get nothing. Al-Kain, however, Hoil Misvara, when it comes to just what I think what we're talking about in Rav Asher Weiss, we're talking about just ethical intuition. Nired mazel shtehen garam. It seems like they're equally at fault. Again, you can't prove they're equally at fault, but that seems to be our instinct. Al kain asiti peshem ratzon shnehem b'chefsam sheyeh hefsed shel shnehem. So I created a compromise, which is what both of them wanted, and both of them wanted each of them to they each agreed that they should lose something, that it shouldn't be one person loses everything and the other person is not involved, and they only wanted me to settle what the proportion was. Right? Aval din Torah lo yadati, but he says, I made a pshara because they agreed. If they had refused to agree to pshara, and they had insisted that I reach a judgment, I wouldn't have known what to do. And then until somebody else comes along and reaches a clearer legal judgment. Okay, so that's to sum up. You can have a whole set of bases for making the judgments. The only real legal basis that is adduced in all these sets of cases is there's a precedent called Makat Medina, about which there's a controversy about what the outcome is. Whether we can find people arguing in all three positions, and therefore the standard outcome of halakhah would be that you simply can't touch the case, and possession is the law. But nobody thinks, it seems nobody thinks that that's really a just outcome. That's just a legal outcome, right? It's not a just outcome it's a question of whether the money, of whether you happen to cash the check and deposit the check in time. So nobody thinks we should judge it in accordance with Torah. So the question then is, what use is Torah? Okay, that's the basic framework. Okay, so I was going to do the opening here, but I think that it's probably more important at this stage to take questions, and we can start from this tomorrow, unless there are no questions, in which case we'll go on to it. So I'm going to stop the share for a minute, and if anybody has questions, now is a great time to ask them. Actually, I might as well just keep. Yeah, I'm sorry, I seem once again to have managed to lose everyone's faces. But people are invited to.
Avarye,
yes,
it's
hi,
Jerry. Jerry here. For the Terumas Hadeshen,
yeah.
So is he telling the judge to figure out what the minhag is? Is that the function of a judge?
Yes, the function of a judge.
What makes him qualified to do that? I mean, it's not that he's a Ben Torah. In fact, the Ben Torah may not know what the minhag is. Might be the worst person to ask.
Well, you're thinking of a Ben Torah as a kollel guy, right? He's talking about a dayanim, and he's talking about dayanim in it who are dealing with cases every day.
Okay.
Right.
So he would have experience, and he would know what the minhag is. Okay.
Yeah, it's one of the fundamental jobs of a dayan is to try and figure out what the reasonable expectations of the parties are. I think that's that should always. It's not necessarily the job of a Ben Torah. Yeshiva guys, he tells you, yeshiva guys might come in and start insisting on formal rules of evidence, and that's a disaster.
Right.
But an experienced practical judge, it might very well be that someone with very little Torah experience will be just as good at that, except that then there are secondary issues, because what a judge could do is appoint a fact finder and then accept the report of the fact finder.
Okay.
Right.
And the other thing on the Chassam Sofer and the other one who talked about what's the relationship between the Peshara and Torah.
Yeah.
That's an interesting question. What is that relationship? And it might. I've always felt it might have something to do with extrapolation. If someone has learned enough, they sort of develop a sensitivity and know how to go on from what they've learned to something that's a new case. Maybe that's a way of understanding what that relationship is. So he talks about analogy.
Yeah. So I think you have to distinguish between the pshara that the Chassam Sofer is talking about. What the Chassam Sofer is saying, I think, is that there are these basic frameworks in halakhah for dealing with distribution of assets amongst the community, right? So there's a partnership analogy, right? There's a distribution there's a priority in terms of charity analogy, and you could try and find several other analogies. The Chassam Sofer that's his model, is that you start from Torah. It's just that the facts of this case may not be exactly like it, so you massage the formal definitions in order to fit into a Torah framework. But I think it's
Right. important
to say that Rav Asher Weiss is not saying that. Right? Rav Asher Weiss says that there's a prior notion, a prior independent notion of ethics, and that sometimes the law is just right. Sometimes the law doesn't get to the right result. The right result is right. The right result is an ethical result, and you don't. And the reason that you encourage pshara is because not because you're not using fuzzy analogies, is because you think that following the law will yield the wrong result, because the law is bound by certain kinds of procedural notions, which may be very different than what is demanded by justice, or because there are cases which law simply can't cover. Right? So he has a nice model case. Right? There are cases where two parties have exactly identical situations. Now, he could have said flip a coin. Right? It's an interesting notion, right? We could have just said there are cases where the proper halakhah is flip a coin, and that might be the pshara. But he seems to think that it's not like in those cases there's nothing to do, so flip a coin. He thinks that there are cases where law hits its limits, it has nothing to say, and you can rely on ethical principles that precede the law. At least that's the way I understand. That's the way I understand Rav Asher Weiss.
Thank you.
Okay, other questions?
Yes. Let's see. This is Richard.
Hi.
So I'm not appearing on the screen, but okay.
Yeah, I can hear you anyway.
We see you.
Tobias aided the
Okay.
caller, as we said last night.
In the current situation like we're in now in the United States or in most Western civilizations, why shouldn't we take the view that expectations are determined by the legal system in which we sign contracts? I mean, that's typically when we have an agreement, when an agreement is made, both sides have expectations based on how contracts are interpreted and what it says in the contract and how they're interpreted. And why shouldn't that be essentially have the same status at least as the minhag of the sailors and so on?
So there are, I think, two kinds of answers to that question. One, in the immediate circumstances, is whether it's really true that people's expectations are, in a crisis of this magnitude.
I'm not talking about in a total disaster which has no precedent, but in terms of normal expectations or reasonably comparable expectations to what happens, that the view that you should decide that a beit din should decide based on the minhag should be interpreted to mean based on the legal laws of the jurisdiction in which you are found, assuming that they don't, I mean, there are well-known things that certain types of laws are invalid on their face and so on. But if you're not in the type of autocratic government which is stealing from the people, that the laws should be the minhag, what counts there as the minhag should be the current legal status and expectations.
So I'll try to answer this in a couple of different ways, and I should say that my answer may not be the consensus answer. This, I think, is this is one of the areas I think which I've been very influenced by J. David Bleich. Here's how I would understand it, I think, without blaming Ray Bleich for anything I say. Right? There is this tension, right, that we do want to preserve some role there has to be some purpose to halakhah, even in a state where halakhah doesn't have exclusive or mandatory jurisdiction. That's seen as a policy goal, and that policy goal is rooted in Eila Mishvatim Asher Tasim Lifnehem. So that's I guess we call it pragmatic ideological reason that we don't want to necessarily say you're right. That is in tension with our desire for for justice, which in many ways implies in accordance with expectations. So the way in which we distinguish it is, here's the test case is, what happens if when we made the contract, the law was one way, but in the interim, the law has changed? Right, that's our test case, right? So my expectations when I signed the contract, entered this agreement, were X, but now, right now, if I went to secular court, I would be right. I would not have my expectations at the time met. So now the question is, do we define our expectations as, right? Do we say that the expectations are everything that was agreed among us substantively at the time? Or am I fundamentally saying, no, I trust this legal system, whatever its outcomes are, more than I trust halakhah? So the last is the objection that we have, right? We object to a framing that whatever that we allow you to stipulate, whatever specific stipulations you want to make are great. But a blanket saying, I trust this system to produce the just outcome more than I trust halakhah, that's a deeply problematic thing. So for example, and the analogy I'll give you, this is what we know where I learned it, is in the context of the prenuptial agreement. So a tension you have in the prenuptial agreement is that if you want it to be decided by Beit Din, if you want the finances to be decided by Beit Din, if you don't, you can opt out. But if you want the finances to be decided by Beit Din, so we recognize that most people's expectations, most people don't expect to go to Beit Din, and in many cases, the expectations of the community are not quite those of halakhah. We don't have enough precedents yet incorporating contemporary expectations to get there. At the same time, right, we want people to go to Beit Din. So what we say is, and again, this is the way I was taught, and I'm not sure that people still necessarily do it that way, but this was Rabbi Blaich's position, I believe, very strongly, and that's where I still am, is you can stipulate that the Beit Din must judge this in accordance with divorce apportionment law as of the date of the agreement. So you can incorporate the entire legal system, but you have to freeze it at the moment you make the agreement, because now what you're saying is, I like the substance of this system, that's fine. But you can't say that the Beit Din should decide in accordance with whatever the law is at the time of the divorce, because that's expressing your faith in the outcomes of the system as opposed to in the substance of the system. So that's how we try, right? That's how we try and do it, because saying that you judge it by what the expectations are now is not a function of, right? Is not a function really of expectations, because the relevant expectations are the expectations when you entered into the contract. So that's a long-winded answer, but I think that's how I would understand it. Is that if it's reasonable to say that Beit Din should evaluate in this matter as well, should make any decisions in accordance with what the expectations of the parties were at the time of the contract, and if the expectations of the parties were that they found the substance of the American legal system to be just, and therefore they just enough that that's what they expected, you can incorporate it that way. But you can't incorporate anything that happened since the time of the contract. Okay, that makes sense?
It makes sense. I don't know enough law to know what contract law says about how changes in the law affect previously agreed contracts.
Right, and I imagine that there are very different, that it very much depends on the language of the contract and the language of the law.
Right, so that is, when you sign a contract, it will sometimes specify the jurisdiction and the time at which, this is to be interpreted according to the laws of X, Y, and Z. So I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah. So prenuptial agreements are not a good example. There are too many other things going on there.
That could be, but employment contracts might or might not be a good example, right? Which is what we're, employment contracts and delivery contracts, all those sorts of things might all have unique cases.
Yeah.
I agree with that. I don't, and again, if it came to Beit Din, I think that in the not many cases I've been involved in, the first thing we always have to do. Let's say we had landlord-tenant cases. The first thing you have to do is look up landlord-tenant law, because the parties sign a contract, and the contract is binding under secular law. So they expect to be bound by secular law. So that's
Right.
That's the first thing a Beit Din does in cases like that. But I also made us check whether the law had changed, whether we were bound by the law as it's in the contract as signed, or if anything had changed dramatically in the interim since then, and judged it by the law at the time of the contract.
Very often, a contract will specify that it is signed in accordance with the laws of such and such a jurisdiction, or subject to certain sections of law as they currently exist, or may subsequently be amended.
Right. So I think that that would be a more challenging question in halakhah, external to the question of din al-malchut dina. Right. Din al-malchut dina is a separate question, right, which is not about expectations necessarily, but might be about jurisdiction. Right. So I think that's also right. We should. I'm bracketing the question of din al-malchut dina. There might be times when halakhah is bound to apply secular law regardless of the expectations of the party, right? Someone comes to court and their expectations were fully halakhic, and you walk in and say, "I'm sorry." This happens a lot with one party in a case, right, where people realize they have no secular case, so they come to Beit Din and try and get Beit Din to enforce something halakhic against the other party. And you look at them and you say, "Sorry, din malchut dina." Right? So I don't, but I think that's a separable area. I think another question, yes, let me just finish that, right? Another question which has to be raised here is the extent to which the American legal system genuinely raises substantive expectations for people, right? Because often, right, in many cases, people have no idea what American law actually says, and don't really, like it. Or they just figure if it happens, it'll get settled in court, but they have no relationship to the substance of the law. And it might be that halakhah takes much less cognizance of the idea it'll be settled in court, right? Because the reasons I raised earlier. Okay, you thought it'd be settled in court, but you have no expectations as to the substance. You agreed to the jurisdiction of our court. So what, right? Once you agree, right? So that's a totally different. That's a totally different matter than if you have substantive expectations. And also, as I mentioned, sometimes the expectations are, I think this is part of what Ray Weiss talks about. Sometimes the expectations are inherently unjust, and that's part of the job of judges, right? And in America, we recognize this, that sometimes, that there are challenges, right? For example, one of the challenges about the prenup is that there are jurisdictions that are highly suspicious of the power relationships involved in prenuptial agreements, and that's why it's best to say that the prenuptial agreement is not related to the secular marriage at all, which is true, because if it were viewed by the secular courts as a prenuptial agreement, it would be subject to much stricter requirements of asset disclosure and things like that. So I think that Beit Din should have the right to say that this is a secular law, but the secular law is fundamentally based on an injustice, right? It's based on on either whatever your political framing is, either on it enshrines illegitimate monopoly power on the part of the employers, or it enshrines illegitimate monopoly power on the part of the workers through a union, right? All of those are ways in which halakhah, like any other judicial system, can put aside contracts if they violate conscience.
Now, also, how does this get affected by social contract theory?
Absolutely. Well, social contract theory is the same issue, right? I think that the Trumas Hadeshin fundamentally takes a social contract position, right? Whatever the group decides among itself has to be binding.
Yeah.
But right, the question is, is it an absolute position, whatever they decide, or do we say no? Some contracts are made among groups in a situation of terribly unjust situations, and so the job of a court system, to the extent that it's capable of doing so without losing its own authority, is to set aside unconscionable contracts. Mm-hmm. We don't know whether but again, there's very little precedent in halakhah, very little precedent in halakhah, and nobody thinks you should use halakhah. So that's really a deep question now in dealing with these issues. What is our basis as Torah scholars for even beginning to address these questions if Torah precedents per se are not the basis on which we're going to do so? Yep.
Ari. First of all, what you said about the expectations of the parties. So I think it would seem that if, for example, have a contract between two lawyers, that it would make sense to apply the law, and they were to put in that clause, right? Then it actually does make sense because they presumably have the expectation of what the legal system would, how it would resolve the case. But if you have any other sort of situation, then maybe between in a particular industry where the law is well known, but otherwise.
That's an interesting idea. It depends. The question is whether law can make distinctions that finely. Whether it's lawyers, but what about lawyers in areas other than their then then their field. What about people who went to law school but then became became corporate radios, whatever it may be. So it's hard to.
But
I
I mean,
agree in principle, but it's hard in practice.
everybody, all lawyers study contract law, and even if you didn't, at least you know that there may be very obscure things that could arise that would invalidate the contract or whatever.
Okay, I'm open to the argument. I'm just not. I'm not making. I'm not taking a strong position.
Sure. And then the other thing is, oh, I forget. All right, I'll come back.
Okay.
Do you really think that there's anyone in America who has preconceived notions about what the law is in this particular case? Or any expectations?
It's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Because I know that I attended this morning a mock class at a law school I'm considering going to, which was all about how there's going to be mass amounts of litigation over how exactly to resolve coronavirus questions, and it'll be fascinating to see how the courts play out and things like that. It doesn't seem like anyone really knows what's going to happen now. But
that's a fair point. And you could make the argument that in America generally, law has gotten so complicated, so it's very hard to have any expectations under most issues. In many areas, I think that's entirely a fair point. I don't know the answer.
Well, in many cases, the expectation would be that you would be covered by unemployment insurance for 4 months or 6 months or whatever. What makes the problem of a Jewish school, for instance, a lot more complicated is that religious organizations are not required to pay into the unemployment insurance system, and therefore their employees would not be covered.
That
may have been changed in this special case by the recent federal legislation. That's something I'm not sure of.
That's correct. We'll talk about that tomorrow. I have that as one of the issues.
Yeah.
Okay, so my other question I think was sort of related to Gabriel's question is, let's say you have a contract based on a certain, the law at a certain date. The problem with that is that there could be changing situations in which it makes sense for the law to change, and in fact, in the civil system, the law does change based on the changing circumstances. But if you freeze the law at a certain point, you're not getting the benefit of the change in the law that everybody agrees should make sense.
Those are we're dealing with like secondary hard cases, right? The first question is, how does halakhah have any basis at all, right? And then if you're saying halakhah is going to be governed, can be governed by expectations, now you're making it much harder as well. I don't think there's I think we've been struggling for 700 years at least, 800 years at least, to figure out how we construct halakhah in a system where even for Jews it's not the default contract system. And we've muddled through, not terribly successfully, as based in America, based on the general indifference of even the Orthodox community to the Beit Din system. Certainly in non-Orthodoxy. So I'm not going to have great answers for you because we haven't succeeded. Okay. Anyone else? Okay, thank you. That was very useful for me. I hope you'll all think about this before tomorrow. And tomorrow we'll just start going through some of the ways that people have attempted to write halakhic frameworks for this, and perhaps we'll also discuss the justice issues and see how far we get in terms of thinking how we would handle this. Thank you all very much, and have a wonderful rest of the day.